Welcome back to Language of the Soul, Conversations on Healing and Growth. I'm Ben Umstead.
And I'm Martin Perkins.
So in the last episode, we brought up Buckminster Fuller, the visionary architect, philosopher, and inventor. Martin, you quoted him in regards to making a new model, seeing that something really can only change when you create something that proves this old model's obsolete. He's talking about it through the lens of his experiences, of course, as an inventor, as an architect. This language of change and creating something new. Through the work that you and I bring to this podcast, not only creating the podcast, but primarily Dao Yin and healing and growth, there is a sense of ease. And change, really foundational change, comes about when the ease is not a state of mind, when the ease is not viewed as something that is an outside possibility, but one is easeful. One is practicing with ease. One is embodying ease. This is what we wanted to talk about today. Some of this is going to touch upon our work together, creating the podcast, doing all the outreach for your practice at Simplicity Farm, and even creating the book, Language of the Soul, Path of Simplicity. Martin, I wanted to turn it over to you to get a sense of this easefulness through the lens of healing and growth.
So much of my life I can aptly describe as being expressed through a sense of struggle. My childhood, my early adult years were all based in this idea that obstacles had to be overcome. I had to fight the existing reality. I had to, in essence, struggle in life. And that's my personal story, right? And I'm the son in an abusive family relationship where my mother was both an alcoholic and as well physically and emotionally abusive with me. So struggle was a real thing in my day-to-day life. When I hear it, various movements out, if we take this outside the lens of the individual and we say, what does it look like in the larger world for any given group of people, whether it be people of color, whether it be women, whether it be within any number of groups, including the struggle now of gender equity, right? What's it like for a person whose gender or sexual identity doesn't match up with the norms of the world? That's a big one. And I'm resistant to give it labels. I'm resistant because I think there's just so much unfolding now in that quote unquote shift, right? And that shift for all the peoples that we're describing often are framed around the notion of struggle, fighting the status quo, fighting whomever or whatever is in control. And I guess for me, having been raised in this and realizing what it felt like to be in that struggle within my family life, realizing at some point how much impact it had on me. Early in life, I didn't recognize it. I didn't see how the degree to which my own painful upbringing, how much impact it had on all my other relationships. I didn't see it. And so therefore I was in an unconscious struggle, not just with the world around me, but with myself. Flashing forward to various chapters throughout my life, I can recognize how the very thing that I struggled against, I became the very thing I was struggling against. And that was a very painful recognition as well, that in struggling, in being in the midst of fighting the existing reality as it existed in me, in my struggles with my mother, I had become more like her than I could ever imagine. And that was an extremely painful recognition. One that even once it was recognized, it took me some time before I realized within myself, how would I go about changing that. And I subscribe very strongly to the notion that, and I want to be clear with this, that the inner journey and the outer journey, what I'm describing as my inner experience, has no less validity when we end up talking about it in the context of societal dynamics, of group dynamics, of cultural dynamics. Because I often think that this notion of the struggle becomes so concretized in how various groups within society relate to each other that, as Buckminster Fuller points out, without a new model, there's no way to make life as it is any different. There can be small incremental improvements, but there isn't that paradigm shift that's hungered for.
I would like to jump in and offer something based off of what you've been sharing of your own personal experience, because what rose up in me was this sense of the struggle. When we talk about it, the struggle is this, there's this picture that can come. You're tussling, you're fighting, it's in motion, it's tumultuous, right? I am finding this wonderful, warm reminder within my practice that on the other side of struggle, when you embrace an energetic practice, meditation, stillness practice, and that ease begins to be your foundation, the struggle is seen through what I would offer is the truth of the struggle. It's rigid. When you hold that in your body, it is not this powerful, flexible thing. It's this rigid, stuck, caught thing. It's like a frozen tree. Its roots aren't growing.
In the context of creative solutions to what was facing me in my youth, what vexed me, in many ways, if we draw the analogy to nature, I was root bound. I was in a pot that was far too small, and I could grow, but then I had my limitations. Within a root-bound paradigm, there's a lack of creative solutions. There's, in essence, very little opportunity for conscious planning, very little opportunity to operate within a practice where life had ease. Home didn't feel like home. Home was bound in the sense that there were so many inherent limitations to what was even possible. One of the funny, I guess not so funny, aspects to all this was, I think at one point I counted the number of places that I lived in from the moment when I left for college until I eventually moved here to Simplicity Farm in 2003. And I had lived in, I believe, between 20 and 25 different places over those years. I never really found any grounding because for me, I was still being root bound. No matter where I went, I was root bound because there was no ease. I was wherever I went there, as the expression goes, wherever you go, there you are. And there I was, feeling extremely root bound by my upbringing and the patterns that I was taught and the state of dis-ease, the agitation, the lack of creative flow. And it was very difficult for me to unwind that pattern. And as it did unfold, as I dove deeper and deeper into my own challenges, in other words, to build a new model means making the existing model obsolete. Okay, so if you're going to make a new model, that's in essence what I did. I created a new model for myself. And it was developed out of a practice in presence. And it was a willingness to delve into the discomfort that was my life as it had been and that as I was still carrying around with me. It wasn't that I was delving into the past. It was I was delving into the present that I had drug from the past. Because a root-bound being doesn't really have the ability to find new, fresh ground.
So you moved to Simplicity Farm, what will be known as Simplicity Farm by name later, in 2003. And I think it's really important to point out to our listeners that you didn't travel far geographically. This is very close to your childhood home. the death of your mom and finding really quite literally a space, literally and metaphorically, spiritually, a space where you are grounding. On a synchronistic level, it's seismic, right? On a life experience level, it's seismic. Where were your feelings in that point? That sense of ease and dis-ease, I think, is really the way to frame it. Was there truly a sense of ease that you were starting to feel at Simplicity at that time?
No, not in any way. It felt like a leap into this place, and it felt really, truly right in making this move. The truth is, it was like a slow release process in which I experienced the possibility of what I was embarking upon, but it would continue to be years of unfolding, of inner work, of getting, in essence, out of my own way, revealing and bringing into the light my own shadows, and not always doing so with the kind of grace and ease that I was hungering for. The relationships I chose romantically reflected my own dis-ease, and as well, I was a young father. I had 2 children, one of which was much older and a 2-year-old at that point. And there were lots of challenges within the family dynamic. And it really only would be after that marriage ended that there would be the kind of depth of exploration that I was at the level that I had been doing work. I had been doing an enormous amount of breath work. I was practicing meditation, practicing Qigong. I was in many ways had begun practicing Dao Yin. And a lot was unfolding that would allow me to create a new model. And part of that model was the recognition that I be willing to dive in. The last pod talks a lot about the concept of diving in, of going for it. This is a different aspect of it, which is how do we bring ease to it? How do we practice life as if there's ease, whether it be in our workplace, whether it be in our inner life, and how the interplay between the inner and outer plays out dynamically in our lives.
I'd love to hone in on this and hear some of the experiences of ease coming through these building projects. By and large, a lot of woodworking, a lot of building from recycled materials, things that really meant you had to learn a new model. You had to learn new skill sets or dive into skill sets that were otherwise rudimentary before.
So the first part of what you're describing was the first project began not long after I moved in, was the need to build a treatment space and as well make necessary changes to the house. Doing so, feeling like I lacked the skills and not really trusting in my own skills, which is another key ingredient that comes when one feels somewhat constrained by the dysfunction of one's childhood, in the analogy I offered, which was that of a root-bound tree. I didn't trust in my creative abilities. I didn't trust in my ability to make things. And some of the excuses that I presented to myself at the time were, I don't have time. So I really subscribed and I really kind of dug in around that. And there was an ounce of truth to it. And the ounce was largely I wasn't making the time. And I wasn't making the time because I really didn't trust myself. Fortunately, I got some help. There were carpenters who I brought in, and I often worked alongside them. And I began to build some confidence. I installed a wood stove into the house with the assistance of a skilled carpenter. When I built the first incarnation of the treatment space here, which is in essence a third of the size that it is currently today, but it was the first small building. It was just a converted Amish shed into a treatment room that had a little waiting room, a bathroom, and a treatment room. It was very, very simple and yet very functional at the same time. I got a lot of help, and I would say the bulk of the work was done by others, but there were things that I did along the way which began to build my confidence as a creative being. One of them being I did all, and then some people might go, oh my God, but I did all the electrical work on the space. My father was a master electrician. I learned a lot from him, and I was able to jump in and capably and safely upgrade the electric so that it could meet both code and the need of the building. What they did here was they cut down all the trees on the property, at least around the house, and just, this very short lawn, like cut lawn, like just perfectly trimmed kind of space. And so when I moved in over the next several years, Luna, my daughter, and I, one of the great activities that she and I shared in is we proceeded to plant over the next several years over 100 trees. It looks nothing like the property that I moved into here, now 20 something years later. It is full of ever more maturing trees, a lot of predominantly native trees, but also, I planted a lot of trees that were non-native. If I knew then what I know now, I might have planted a little differently. I planted a lot of herbs around the property, perennials, and I let it kind of unfold. And it was an incredibly freeing and expansive part of my growth. Another and really significant step I took was embarking upon building a treehouse, which was huge for me. I had never taken on a big project like that. And while I had a lot of help, namely from you, Ben, and from Luna, in large measure, I led the process. I was sort of the lead carpenter on it and had this extraordinary experience of learning to trust in my abilities to create. The next big project was tripling the size of the Healing and Growth Center. I embarked upon that project without getting the proper permitting and was met by the county with more than the very strong request that I get the proper permitting, which I in turn did, but it really began a very potent practice within me and really speaks to this notion of ease, which was when the county came along and required permitting, I was very close to what I thought at that point was a state of completion and had to stop, get the proper drawings in place, get their approval, work with the inspector, bring in an electrician to pull the permit, even though I had done the electrical work, and for him to go in and ensure that the work I had done was up to code, which it was. And at the end of the day, most importantly, to stop approaching life as something that needed to get done, and instead approach life with, how am I being with myself? Am I working with ease? Am I practicing life with ease? Am I open to the creative opportunity of this moment? Am I engaged with a level of conscious planning? And as well, am I willing to allow the process to unfold creatively that might, on some level, require me to keep changing whatever planning I had put in place? I was inspired by the idea that the room, the wood, the space itself could inform me about what it would look like. So I would often sit and simply be in the space and breathe and allow what needed to unfold to do so. It created a level of ease in me, and I was learning how to work with ease by willing to pause and relax over and over and over again into the activity, to prioritize how I do it over how much I was getting done. And the result is it allowed me to feel, well, initially, I was constantly pushing up against that feeling of being less productive, which was an old story for me because I had lived my life feeling root bound. So I always felt less productive than I could be. This analogy of being root-bound is something that I've come to recognize having done the healing and growth work. In the midst of it, I didn't recognize myself as being root-bound. In the long term, it transformed my experience of life. And freed me from that root-bound pot and allowed my roots to form here in ways that I would have never imagined. And in the ensuing years, I've done a lot of work with mosaics, with both tile and glass. I've done work in building or rebuilding. After a fire, my workshop was burned down, and I took an existing pony barn and turned that into my workshop. And then very recently, I've been enclosing my front porch. All of these projects are just really great examples of me continuing to learn and how to practice being in life with ease, always focused on how do I allow myself to exist through that new model, which for me is putting ease, creative life force at the forefront of my process and allowing the result to unfold naturally out of that.
You talked so much about the confidence that you were feeling as the work continued to unfold. You spoke so much of that hand in hand with the ease. That really struck me because I think we often, in a status quo sense, look at confidence as this kind of ego booster or confidence as an aggressive quality dominating, leering over others, because in a patriarchy that can often be coupled with aggressive behavior. But the confidence that you're speaking of in a dance, in a relationship to ease, and the unfolding of these practices is just so warm. It's just so lovely. It really strikes me as a crucial leap for all of us in our grounding and integration and practice of ease, to have this confidence of ourselves, not really rooted to habits and patterns and expectations or the need for recognition or validation in society. It's our own confidence that really is just a reflection of how we do things. The confidence story for me has been a very crucial one that I've chosen to keep small, in a pot, rooted, and really go, okay, well, I can grow within this pot. I can grow within this little bit of soil, but I'm not allowed to grow outside of that. I say this because of our work together, our conscious planning. The truth of the matter is, for me, and I'd love to hear your feelings on this, is that the foundations of what you and I did in bringing your book to life and then bringing the podcast to life and the newsletter to life, all of these touchstones of healing and growth of Language of the Soul in media really began much earlier in the family friendship to some extent. But you mentioned the treehouse, and you mentioned that Luna and I had worked on that with you. And the part that I worked on with you was actually the foundation of the treehouse, attaching the beams to the tree and figuring out how this was going to be secure, how this was going to be safe. Foundational, right down to the absolute literal movements that we were doing and actions that we were taking with the wood, with the bolts, with the metal, with the earth. I really believe and feel from my depths that being a great unfolding for what we started to do in a different manner years and years later.
The quality that you bring to the table as a creative partner in many ways was and has been so helpful and ideal in my own unfolding and growth as teacher, as a voice expressing himself into the world. You have this wonderful ability to both foster and support, and at the same time, challenge when necessary, and also bring in your own creative ideas and recognizing those moments with a high level of being astute in it. I think it's taken a lot of practice for both of us to learn. I often talk about the language of the soul as an expression of something that we learn by going into ourselves. But then there's also, how does that language find expression with other beings? I've known you since you were young. You knew me since I was younger. And, now we're not per se young, but we're not, neither. I don't see it as a young old. I see you more as a partner in this process. And it's opened doors, I think, for both of us. Now, we play some roles where, you are a student as well. So we wear different hats in different circumstances. I have to be willing to put on that hat and be guide and teacher. You and I have both been in practice now for several years, changing hats and being willing to practice that with ease.
And I think it speaks to the conscious planning. When you are consciously planning with someone else, it really is about how you do the work and the project itself. Like, what is that expression? The book was an incredible expression of all of the time as a human being in this reality and in this nonlinear inner space of cultivating healing and growth and being in practice with Tao Yin and putting that into words and figuring out what that meant. And you came to me with these raw texts, right? Very foundational. I want to make that very clear. A lot of what is in the published book and continues to be refined in the coursework and in the podcast and in the newsletter in creating the book was our practice in terms of a student-teacher relationship. And I mean that from you to me and from me to you. And how it unfolded was so beautiful. At times, there were challenges. We had to figure a lot of things out. Oh my gosh. I mean, just from the practical stuff that comes up in terms of, do we self-publish? Do we go out and try to find agents or managers, publishers who might be receptive to the work? Okay, we're going to self-publish because the energy of kind of screaming into the void, as we put it, when we wrote those letters and made those pitch packets. It was extraordinary to just also have this work be the foundation, because when frustration came up, both of us knew that we really had to be honest with each other about that in order to serve the book. There is this greater expression that was being cultivated. And if the frustration really led the process, well, nothing was going to happen. That was going to create a static space. And so the conscious planning for us, I think, in that process really was just making sure to be authentic with how we were feeling that day and that moment, and making sure to have the space within ourselves and the shared space with each other to go like, I can't do any more of these emails like this. I don't know if it is the right path to go. And because of the I don't know, because of the frustration, making a different choice.
As you're speaking, and we've spoken, obviously, within the context of the pod, we've spoken of the 4 forms of rest. And I just can't emphasize how important those forms have been in our interactions. The many, many times that one or both of us would simply need to pause within the process and step away for some period of time and allow there to be ease and stillness in ourselves so that we could come back to the process. Not because there was conflict between us, but because there was an inner recognition that there was a lack of ease in that moment within one or both of us. We stopped and we just both recognized today's not it. What I didn't want to do was to delve into outreach that didn't feel like I could do it with ease. I can't tell you the number of people that I've spoken with who have successful social media presences. And just frankly, the level of tension, of agitation that they experience in playing that role. I've not experienced anyone who has what I would describe a healthy relationship with social media. And I wasn't interested in doing that, of just making the result or the need for recognition, for validation, to override my inner practice. I needed my inner practice to be reflected in the work, in what we practice. This rhythm that we created of putting out a podcast every 2 weeks. That's in large measure the byproduct of a rhythm that we both mutually established. We looked at weekly, and we looked at what that would mean if we had a weekly podcast. And we said, no, that's not going to work for us, given all the things that we're seeking to manifest in our lives. What would the pod look like if we were to do this from a place of balance and ease? And in many ways, as crazy as it might sound to some people, yes, I do seek for more people to see and experience what we're sharing. But I'm not going to allow a need for recognition, for validation, and fulfillment through that lens, which is largely a very superficial lens, a very superficial need for what you're creating to be consumed in order for us to feel okay. So what we're creating needs to stand on its own legs. We need to feel as if at the end of the day, no matter who listens to this, how many people listen to it, we're feeling truly creatively and energetically fed by our own process. And in doing so, my affirmation of our shared work and my work in general in the world is that there's an ever-growing number of people exploring healing and growth and exploring their own inner soul language. And my hope is that our podcast helps open that door.
If you'd like to learn more about Language of the Soul, whether in book form, which is now an audiobook, as well as a paperback, you can do so by visiting martinperkins.com. Over there, you're also going to be able to check out what's coming up at Simplicity Farm, the actual space, and Simplicity more as a community-driven idea that can be shared digitally as well. One of those things is the movie club that we have been doing over the last 6 months or so. On Thursday, December 5th, you can participate in the discussion on Ava DuVernay's origin. That's going to be via Zoom at 7 p.m. Thursday, December 5th.
I wanted to touch upon the course and remind people that I offer a year-long course that avails individuals, people who are truly seeking to bring a depth of consideration around healing and growth into their lives, to truly learn one's soul language in ways that allow life's calling and life's vibrancy to express itself. I structure that course as a year-long course because we need that kind of space in our lives in order to create the kind of changes that we've, in large measure, resisted to this point in our lives. Patterns that we've been carrying around since we were children, and learning how to do so with the kind of ease that we've spoken of today.
There's also a sense of ease in coming together as a community and celebrating such things as the winter solstice. So on December 21st, that's a Saturday, Martin, you'll be hosting a winter solstice celebration at Simplicity Farm.
Beginning at dusk or thereabouts, we'll share a bonfire, we'll share refreshments, we'll share a silent meditation prior to the bonfire, and in general we'll experience that beautiful recognition seasonally that comes with that day and time, and that return to a sense of light. And in these times of challenge, any and all opportunities to connect with the light of our beings, I offer, are worthy of exploration.